Stories of Princes and Princesses. Chapter 1. The Clumsy Prince. Colin was the clumsiest prince in the kingdom. Other princes fought dragons. Colin fell over them. Other princes battered villains. Colin bumped into them. One day, he tripped in front of a sad princess. She thought he was so funny. She wanted to marry him on the spot. "Are you princely enough to marry my daughter?" Her father had other ideas. He gave Colin 3 tests. Tests he knew Colin would not pass. First, Colin had to show how polite he could be, but he was so busy talking politely to the queen. "May I pass you the sugar, ma'am?" "Careful, Daddy," that he didn't see the butler. Next, he had to take the princess out, but somehow he lost the royal boat. Then he had to ride the royal horse like a prince. "He rides like a clown," said the king. "He must leave the palace tomorrow." That night, Colin couldn't sleep. Suddenly, he heard a scream. It was the princess. "Help! I'm being kidnapped." Colin jumped. What was going on? Was someone stealing the princess? He leaned out of his window and sent a flower pot flying. Ow! Straight onto the head of the man stealing the princess. The princess thief fell to the ground with a thud. Colin raced from the tower and swept up the princess. "Got you." The king and queen raced out too. "What's going on?" cried the king. "What has clumsy Colin done now?" "He's rescued me," said the princess. "Really?" said the king. "Really," she said. The king smiled. "Well, the reward for rescuing a princess is to marry her," he said. "Oh, Colin." So Colin lived clumsily but happily ever after. Chapter 2. The Princess Who Would Not Get Married. Prue liked being a princess, except for one thing. She didn't want to marry a prince. "You have to," said her dad. "It's what princesses do." The king asked 3 princes to visit. "Choose one," he told Prue. But Prue didn't want to. "Princes are boring," she said. "Too plump, too tall." Prue did like the 3rd prince, but she didn't say so. "Too hairy." The king was angry. "If you won't marry a prince, you marry the first man who comes to the castle." The very next day, a beggar arrived, playing an old violin. "I order you to marry my daughter." "Yes, sir, your majesty." Prue and the beggar were married on the spot. With his beard, the beggar reminded Prue of someone. Whoever he was, she didn't want to marry him, but the beggar took Prue home as his wife. "Welcome to your new home." "Cheer up," he said. "If you marry a prince, you'd have to live in a boring castle." The beggar was kind, but very poor. They wore old rags and never had enough to eat. Prue was used to servants. Now she did everything. The floors at the palace seemed to stay clean. One day, the beggar brought home some straw. "We can make baskets to sell," he said, but the straw cut Prue's hands. "This is no good." "You must get a job," said the beggar. "Prince Alec is getting married. Perhaps you can work in the castle over the hill." The castle cook was pleased to have help. She took pity on Prue and gave her some food. Prue was going home when she passed the ballroom. She sighed. There was Prince Alec giving a speech to his guests. Perhaps it wouldn't have been so bad to marry a prince. Just then, the prince turned around and saw her. "You're the hairy prince," cried Prue. "I wonder if she knows." Prue tried to run away, and the food fell from her apron. The guests began to laugh. "I'd like to dance with you," said the prince, and he reached for her hand. "Just one dance." Prue burst into tears. She pulled her hand from the prince and fled. But Prince Alec caught up with her. Prue looked at him closely. It was her beggar. "Don't you recognize my violin?" He took her back to the ballroom. "Would you marry a prince now?" asked Alec. "I would," said Prue, "but I'm already married to you. No more floors to scrub, ever. Scrub."